make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
We are likely to see additional maps coming out of Alabama, Louisiana, maybe even South Carolina. And all of this is just, an hors d'oeuvre for what's going to happen in 2028 when Republicans are able to go after the rest of those seats in the South and when Democrats are going to counterattack all over the country, probably in New York and Colorado, New Jersey, Washington State, maybe go back into California. This is about to become a redistricting free-for-all, and the end result is probably going to be fewer competitive seats than we've ever had, which is saying something, being as how there's not that much right now. Almost entirely all red delegations from red states, almost entirely blue delegations from blue states. And I think one of the really important pieces of this as well, on the question of racial representation, we are likely to see the largest reduction in black representation and political power that we've seen in this country since the end of Reconstruction.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. What's going on, Josh?
Doing just fine. What's going on, Will?
I am doing well. Thanks for asking. And joining us again is David Daley. He is a senior fellow at FairVote and a leading expert on redistricting, gerrymandering, and voting rights. He's also the author of a book called Ratf KED. And I'm not saying
can't say that on Faithful Politics.
This is a family show. Why your vote doesn't count. He is a foremost expert on all things elections and voting, and we're just so glad to have him back because there's a lot to talk about. So welcome back to Faithful Politics, David.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I guess we'll just jump right into it. Currently, as we're recording this, it seems like the state of our elections, or at least voting in the country, is somewhat discombobulated. There are a lot of different things happening in a lot of different states. Before we dive down into some of the more specifics that we asked you to come here for, can you just give us a state of the union? What is the state of our election system and voting for the year 2026?
Whew. Well, we have midterm elections coming up in November. That's only 6 months from now. And we don't know what the maps are going to look like in some of these states for the all-important race for the U.S. House. So really, I'm an expert in gerrymandering and redistricting, which means I am a lot of fun at parties. People see me coming and they head the other way. I end up with a title like that for my book because people are like, it's the most boring topic in the world. You can't give it a boring name. But redistricting and gerrymandering is really at the heart of what's happening right now with our elections. And redistricting, we usually do it once a decade. It usually happens right after the census in order to account for population changes. The idea of this is to actually make things more fair, to be certain that every district is equal. Well, politicians being politicians, they've also figured out that the ability to draw these district lines and to decide who's in them and who's out of them gives them a big leg up when it comes to picking winners and losers. And as the technology has gotten that much better, they're able to refine their approach and really know the result of an election oftentimes before a single ballot is even cast. The state of the House is very, very close, right? Republicans currently have a 3-seat edge. So in the middle of 2025, Donald Trump went to Texas and he said, give me 5 more seats. Let's do a mid-decade redistricting. Pretty rare. Doesn't usually happen. But Texas went ahead and reworked their map and they added an additional 5 Republican seats. California said, well, if you're going to do that, so are we. And so they drew a map that has 5 more Democratic seats. Didn't stop there. Republicans went into Missouri and North Carolina and Ohio. Democrats said, well, you took 4 districts there. We're going to go into Virginia. And that was where things stood a couple of weeks ago. The two parties had largely fought these unprecedented mid-decade gerrymandering wars to a draw. The U.S. Supreme Court said, not so fast. And they, in a case from Louisiana, this case is called Callais versus Louisiana, they essentially really upended what was left of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which had to do with the drawing of majority-minority seats. And I'm sure we can get into the history of that and what it means. Essentially, there are about 19 of these districts across the South, districts that are protected so that communities of color are not sliced and diced amongst districts and don't have the ability to elect a member of their own choosing, even when they have enough people and population to do so. And so ever since that decision came down, and in anticipation of that decision coming, we've seen Florida rework its map to about 4 additional Republican seats. We have seen Tennessee take the Memphis area seat. We are likely to see additional maps coming out of Alabama, Louisiana, maybe even South Carolina. And all of this is just, an hors d'oeuvre for what's going to happen in 2028 when Republicans are able to go after the rest of those seats in the South and when Democrats are going to counterattack all over the country, probably in New York and Colorado, New Jersey, Washington State, maybe go back into California. This is about to become a redistricting free-for-all, and the end result is probably going to be fewer competitive seats than we've ever had, which is saying something, being as how there's not that much right now. Almost entirely all red delegations from red states, almost entirely blue delegations from blue states. And I think one of the really important pieces of this as well, on the question of racial representation, we are likely to see the largest reduction in Black representation and political power that we've seen in this country since the end of Reconstruction.
That's a lot. And I understand now why you wanted to name your book Ratf **KED, because it sounds like that is sort of the moment that we are in. And I definitely want to talk about the Louisiana thing. But given that, Faith of Politics is located here in Virginia, we have been sort of immersed in this, redistricting vote for the past several months. I've got probably no less than a dozen mailers that, depicts Jim Crow era voting sort of scare tactics, which is really weird. Number one, because my middle schooler checks the mail when he comes home from school every day. So every time those mailers came in, it always presented a very interesting discussion moment where he's like, why are these Black people not able to vote, Dad? And I'm like, well, that's not the story, and with everything happening in Virginia, one day it was okay, now there's going to be a 10-to-1 map. And now there's not going to be a 10-to-1 map. Can you just help us make sense of what the heck is happening in Virginia?
Virginia's complicated story, as you all know. And in many ways, you all got sort of caught in the partisan crossfire. And what's happening in Virginia in many ways, right, is a sign of just how bad gerrymandering is. And just what it does to take power away from voters. So it was only, a little over 5 years ago that more than 60% of voters in Virginia, and for that to happen, it has to be Democrats, Republicans, and independents, amended the state constitution in order to put, a bipartisan, fair, citizen-centered redistricting in place in Virginia. And the result was one of the fairest maps in the country. I believe right now you have a 6-5 Democratic delegation.
Yeah.
That's about what Virginia is most of the time. And if it's a big Republican year, maybe it could tip Republican, and a big Democratic year, you could probably have a couple of those seats be competitive the other way. So Virginia looked like they had this all sorted out. But the trouble is, whenever some states are bad actors, it leaves everybody else sort of vulnerable, and once, the thing about a national congressional map is anything one state does has ripple effects for everybody else. So once Missouri and Ohio and North Carolina redrew, people began looking to see, well, where can Democrats even this out? And it's not fair for Republicans in Virginia in the same way it's not fair for, Democrats in North Carolina. But here we are, it's a zero-sum game when you have single-member districts. So in order to get this through, Democrats needed to pass it in 2 consecutive legislatures, and then they needed to take it to the people of Virginia for a vote. They did this. It won narrowly, 51-48, to enact this, brutal 10-1 map. Republicans took it to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court overturned it, largely on a technicality saying that, essentially having to do with the meaning of the word election. Republicans, this had to be within a certain period of days before an election. And Democrats said, well, an election means election day. And Republicans said, no, an election means the start of early voting. And the court narrowly, in a 4-3 decision said it means once voting starts. And so this map is likely not going to be used in the fall. Virginia will likely be back to the old map, which is a 6-5, a Democratic map with a couple of competitive districts. I believe that even without, gerrymandering the state into oblivion, with good candidates and good campaigns, Democrats probably still pick up a couple of seats in Virginia. Maybe that's the way it should be, right? Good candidates run a good race and
that
persuade
sounds,
people. Don't draw the lines one way.
My goodness. What did you just say? It's like my mind is being blown right now.
Wow. It's crazy, right?
Just good candidates in competitive districts that are going to be there for their voters. It's like a pipe dream. It's like a dream of heaven. David, when we're talking about this, one of the complaints I've heard is that this was on a technicality. This Virginia Supreme Court decision, of course, now this is going to be on its way to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. Where do you imagine this going? And do you think it was a technicality, or is this like how do you interpret that? I guess that decision.
I think it is a technicality, right? I mean, I think how you define the word election, you could argue that either way. And I think, a lot of election lawyers looked at this case and said, I could see it, coming out either way. So it's, it's certainly not a clear cut. One side is obviously right here. It will move on to the Supreme Court. I think it's very hard to imagine that this Supreme Court will allow a 10-1 Democratic gerrymander, while the Chief Justice continues to assure us that they're not a partisan political branch of government. Their actions suggest otherwise, even the ones this week. And so, I don't think that they're going to reach down and stop that. So I imagine that the Virginia gerrymander is probably dead.
Wouldn't this, though, set a precedent then to potentially challenge this in other states, the gerrymandering that's happened, or no? Or is it because of the technicality of it, it doesn't fit in the other state?
Yeah. Every state has different rules on redistricting, and every state's constitution speaks to this a little bit differently. What this also speaks to, right, is the importance of judges, and in lots of states, the political parties have, sort of buttressed their gerrymanders by also being certain that the Supreme Court is packed in their favor. We have seen, Democrats in New York do this. We've seen Republicans in Florida, Arizona, Utah, Ohio, North Carolina. So this is, a really complicated issue, and it becomes a lot harder for voters to get relief here. That to me was the real sadness of what the Supreme Court did back in 2019 in the Rucho case out of North Carolina, where they closed the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims. This was the best opportunity for us to have a national standard. And at the time, you had federal judges appointed by presidents of both parties looking at partisan gerrymanders drawn by both parties, by Democrats in Maryland, by Republicans in Ohio and Wisconsin and North Carolina. And you had these judges say, we have everything we need to determine when one of these maps goes too far. We have standards, we have evidence, we can treat this like any other trial, we know what we're doing. When, by the way, if we don't do this, voters are left completely on their own because they can't appeal to their politicians when their politicians are the ones who did this in the first place. And so the Rucho case was our best chance to solve this, but that's not what the Supreme Court did. Instead, the Supreme Court said that this is a political issue. We can't decide political issues, right? They don't do that. And they essentially opened the door to all of these gerrymanders in all of these states. They removed any chance that any state might be held accountable. And so they unleashed this sort of, gerrymandering Armageddon that, threatens now to devour the entire congressional map.
Switching gears over to Louisiana and the Voting Rights Act case, this is actually a case that I have not really been spending a lot of time reading about, but I know that it has, gargantuan implications for a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'd love for you to, kind of 30,000 foot this, and then we can kind of drill into the details. Like, how did this case get to the Supreme Court? Like, what are some of the particulars that led to it? If you happen to know who was arguing, I'm just kind of curious. That might be helpful. But yeah, just familiarize us with the Louisiana case.
Well, the Louisiana case, it's very complicated, of course, and it moves through lots of different permutations. But I think the important thing to understand here is that Louisiana drew a 4-2 map. It has 6 congressional districts. It drew 4 Republican seats, and it drew a map that had 2 seats that were Black opportunity districts. The population in Louisiana, it's about a third Black. So it worked out that, 2 was essentially the, right number. White citizens, a handful of white citizens in Louisiana were the plaintiffs here. And indeed, one of them, Mr. Callais, was present on January 6th at the Capitol. And they argued that this was an unfair racial gerrymander. They essentially argued that allowing for these Black opportunity districts was discriminatory against them, and that this was an unfair racial gerrymander as a result. Now, what the Voting Rights Act has said on this question and how the courts have ruled is that there has to be the creation of an opportunity districts where minority voters have the chance to elect a member of their community anytime that those voters exist in significant numbers within a compact enough a population and in a state with a history of racially polarized voting. And so that all applied in Louisiana. And so these two districts were drawn. And that essentially set up the challenge from these white plaintiffs.
So if I understand the tension here, there's two tensions here. One is there's Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, right, which essentially says that states can't dilute minority votes, correct? Like
correct.
That's it's layman's terms. They can't make minority votes count less. And then you have an equal protection clause that says that you can't, I guess, when applied to gerrymandering, that race shouldn't be overly used in that. And I guess, I'm trying to understand, how can we be saying that race-conscious remedies are required and then they're also forbidden? And what is that accurate, the tension here in this case? And maybe take that and make it so a layman can understand what's going on. Yeah,
you've got your finger on the complicated crux of racial gerrymandering law in this country for the last 40 years. It becomes this question of how much race is too much race, and when has race been used too much in order to draw district lines. And that is always a balancing act. Now, in a state that has a history of racially polarized voting and that has, a population that is about a third Black, simple math ought to solve, some of the complicated law. There ought to be an opportunity to elect in at least 2 of those 6 districts. And it doesn't mean automatically elect. It means an opportunity to elect. And the threat of vote dilution in these states with racially polarized voting is that these communities are drawn into pieces. They're sliced and diced in such a way that a minority community is carved up like a pizza, and some of them are at the tip of every district, and then those districts go out into more rural, whiter, more conservative areas, and then there is no opportunity to elect. What the court told us in this case is that times have changed. We don't necessarily need all of these protections anymore. And unfortunately, what we've seen since that decision came down is this exact kind of slicing and dicing, right? I mean, Memphis, the district in Memphis, Tennessee, which had been a Black opportunity district going back many decades now, carved into 3 pieces, stretched out into the middle of Tennessee, no real opportunity to elect there. And I imagine that's what we will see on new maps in Alabama and Louisiana as well.
There's probably a reason that, the first article I read about this particular story didn't resonate, because it's like, this is a complicated story. I mean, it's got lots of layers, and it feels almost like this is going to be somewhat unrelated, but related at the same time, like the Mueller report, where it's like the Mueller report came out. I read the thing multiple times. I'm trying to tell everybody about it. They're just like, I have no idea what you're talking about, Will. Like, are you speaking Russian now? And I'm just like, forget it. And this seems like one of those things where it's got so many different moving pieces, but it's going to be so consequential to like what America looks like. So I'd love for you just to expand a little bit more about how are people taking what the Supreme Court did and, using that to, I don't know, suddenly redraw their maps, and if I'm mischaracterizing that, just correct me, because I don't know if they were already in the process of redistricting, or if this SCOTUS case was the catalyst.
Yeah, this SCOTUS case was the catalyst. I mean, if you look around the country, right, there was a lot of mid-decade redistricting going on last year and this spring, but it wasn't happening in Louisiana or Alabama or Florida or Mississippi or South Carolina or Tennessee, right? And that's because these districts were protected. And as soon as those protections were removed, these districts are all of a sudden in the crosshairs. So this very much has to do with the court's decision. And the court told us that these protections weren't needed. And yet we can see in the days afterwards, in the hours afterwards, what the consequences are. It reminds me a lot of the court's decision in the Shelby County case that began this, slow bleeding of the Voting Rights Act back in 2013, when it put an end to preclearance, the most important enforcement mechanism. And the court said, things have changed in the South. 2013 isn't 1965. Things have gotten a lot better. And it's hard to argue that, right? I mean, it's not 1965, and things certainly are better, right? I mean, registration rates are, not 4% anymore. A lot of these things have changed. But the question is, have things changed sufficiently when the second that protections are removed, some of the same old laws come back? And that's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was trying to say in her dissent in that case, when she said, she likened the Voting Rights Act to an umbrella that you hold up in a rainstorm. And she said, you don't get rid of your umbrella in a rainstorm and think you're not going to get wet. And if you throw it, you're not dry because it's not raining. You're dry because you're holding up something to protect you. And we can say that things have changed, but if all of a sudden we throw the protections aside and get soaked, maybe we haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe.
Yeah, I think that's the big question, isn't it? Have we changed sufficiently? Is the argument that, well, it's not 1965 and things have changed? I guess, what is that argument grounded in terms of, right, I guess, public view and sentiment, laws, actual laws in the books, things like that. And I guess you made a statement about this taking us back to the Reconstruction. And, when someone hears that, and I've heard that in a few different places, and when someone hears that, they might feel shock, they might feel anger, or they might feel disagreement. Well, how can you say that it's taking us back there when we say that things have changed? And I just even in light of I guess in the spirit of the question you're just answering, the way I think the trajectory you're just going, I just would love for you to go further into that and kind of help us understand why we should be very concerned about this in terms of, is the rainstorm there, right? And some people may think that's an ignorant question. And I understand that there's quite a bit out there that's to be concerning. I'm more asking this about someone who is very skeptical coming into this, and they're thinking, well, the Voting Rights Act did what it needed to do, during the time, and now we need to move on. There might be people that are very sympathetic to that view as well as antagonistic, and I get that. So why should the people that are sympathetic be concerned? Like, hey, this actually is taking us to a place we don't want to go.
When I say this might take us back to a period like that, I certainly don't mean it's going to take us back to a period of protests or lynchings or, violence when anybody who's not white attempts to go up to a polling place. But what I do mean is that when we look at the political map after the 2026 and after the 2028 elections, there might not be many, if any, Black lawmakers still in the U.S. House from any of these southern states. And so the political map will look a lot like it did from 1900 until 1965. North Carolina, when it elected Mel Watt and Eva Clayton to the U.S. House back in the 1990s, these were the first Black members elected from North Carolina since 1900. So in some of these states, it's a century of not having representation that is aligned to your community or to your interests. And I think that's really dangerous, and it's anti-democratic, especially when these communities exist in numbers that they ought to have some representation. Nobody's asking for all of the political power, right? People are asking for a chance to elect up to the numbers that they represent. So, and to not have schemes that make it possible to stand in the way and block that kind of representation. It used to be that, cities would elect all of their members at large from a city council. And the point of at-large elections would be that the majority group would win every seat. And when you do that for city council and for school board or for Congress, it gives all of the power to one side, and it doesn't require any sharing. And with all of the power, comes all of the resources. And all you have to do is look at what happened, in southern cities when all of the resources were on one side, where they went to as far as, parks or schools or, fixing potholes. And that really is what we are talking about. We're talking about the idea of representation and what it means. And by getting rid of the Voting Rights Act, essentially here, it's going to affect representation at every single level of American political life. Not just Congress, which is what we're talking about, but also state legislatures, local school boards, judicial races. And when it's this easy to draw lines that, dilute and slice and dice and crack communities, it's possible to take all of the power in all of the places. And when that happens, something really serious dies, I think, in a democracy.
When thinking about like gerrymandered maps that are gerrymandered either for political purposes or for racial purposes, reasons, like is there any like discernible like similarities or are all political maps kind of de facto, racially gerrymandered maps? Like what's the best way to kind of look at the difference between those two?
Whenever you have someone drawing district lines, you're going to have choices that are being made. And so it becomes a question around what are the rules governing those choices so that elections are equitable and fair and representative. And, Virginia, as we've seen, Virginia is not a 91% Democratic state. But you can draw a 10-1 map. It's not fair, but you can do it. And if you have 52% of the legislature and 51% of the population say, we're going to do it, you can cram through your map that gives you 91% of the power. It's wrong. It's fundamentally, not how this is supposed to work. And the same way, right? In Louisiana, it would be, or Alabama, both of which have 6 districts and are about a third black, it would be really easy to draw maps that, take those black communities and scatter them across all of those districts. You can do it, right? You could draw a 52-0 map in the state of California if you wanted to. You could draw a 17-0 in Illinois if you wanted to. You could probably get pretty close to 100% in Texas and Florida. But is that what we want? What happens to our politics when that's what happens, right? When you have non-competitive districts, all the energy moves into the party primary. You might have 12 candidates running in that party primary, so someone can win it with 18% of the vote, and then they go into a non-competitive election with, we all know party primaries tend to be, won sometimes by the craziest of the crazy on whatever side. And then those people go to Washington and they're not looking to represent everybody. They're looking to represent their voters in the primary because that's how they got there and that's how they can lose. So we polarize ourselves. We lose the ability to talk, in coalitions, to talk to one another. When all of these states have 100% delegations from one party or another, you lose the voice of rural Democrats and urban Republicans, Southern Democrats, Northeast Republicans. Those have been the deal makers in other Congresses. Those are people who can talk to everybody and kind of get things done. So our choice is trying to find a way that leads us towards coalition and dialogue and compromise and talking to one another, or elections that further polarize us. I know which path I'd rather choose. I think there's a way to get there, right? A more proportional U.S. House would elect Republicans, Democrats, independents from every district in every state. You would likely, see the politics as well as the, racial breakdowns of states represented more accurately and fairly. John Adams talked about, Congress being a perfect replica of the people in miniature. We don't have that. It's getting worse. We need to fix it and make it better.
I have a friend who the other day texted me an AI image of like Virginia redistricted according to the founders or something like that. He's smart enough to know that, don't trust AI, but it was more or less just of a conversation starter, saying like, yeah, this is kind of like how the founders envisioned. And it was, it was like layered. It kind of looked like one of those barbershop poles, and just had lines and everything was like perfect. And I'm just like, oh, well, that would be great, So I'm curious, like in your opinion, like what do you think the founders would have thought or would think about just our current state of, I don't know, like gerrymandering? And I know it's a bit of a loaded question, but so I'm just, like high level, like would they approve? Would they say, yeah, that's democracy? Or like, what do you think?
They did it too. Mm-hmm. As long as we've had politicians, we've had these districts. Gerrymandering takes its name from Elbridge Gerry, who was one of the signers of these founding documents. He was the governor of Massachusetts in 1812 when they were drawing state Senate districts up here, trying to help out his party and to screw over the Federalists. You can trace it back even further, though, to Patrick Henry trying to keep James Madison out of our very first Congress. We've been doing it for a long time. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it good, and no other country in the world gives their politicians this kind of power. Every other modern democracy has hit upon a better way of doing this that does not allow the lawmakers themselves to draw their own lines, choose their own voters, and entrench themselves in power. So we don't have to do it this way. It is a really silly idea. I mean, of course, politicians shouldn't have the ability to draw these maps and choose their own voters and lock themselves in office. And by the way, the technology, and I don't even mean AI, the technology that these guys have now is the ability to do this like a video game, And, in the video games we think of from our childhood, Atari or, Pac-Man or any of those things, they're a little bit better now. The ones my kid has are pretty real life, Madden football is pretty gosh darn good. And so when they take the data that they have, the public data, but also all of the private data that can be collected on each one of us from our web searches, from our purchases, from the maps of where we go, the magazine subscriptions we have, When these map makers draw these lines, they know every last thing about every single person in these houses. They know what car you drive. They know if you have a hunting license. They know if you have a gun license. If you drive a certain kind of truck or a certain kind of car, I can tell you something about you. All of that is there, and they go up and down these streets. And I've driven these streets going around the country, and it's like, oh, that's so interesting how this side of the street and that side are different. Well, oftentimes they are. Politics change, right? The demographics change block to block. They know this when they're drawing these lines. They couldn't do that back in Patrick Henry's days. They couldn't even do it back in the 80s and 90s. The politicians were doing this on napkins down at the bar in California. It is a high-tech game, and it's taken, and we have to give them rules, or else they will continue to abuse it.
So, what are the moral obligations of citizens like us who now live in these democratic systems that feel like they're falling apart and are structurally manipulated at a level of sophistication that's, mind-blowing, and of course, bringing in AI, it will even get more personalized and more sophisticated in their ability to draw lines to stay in power. And so I guess, we want to get our voices out there and everything. We don't feel like we're being represented and all that. But what is the moral obligation? Is it how does the normal citizen jump in and get involved in politics without being corrupted, or, whatever it is? Because it seems like good people are leaving. And
we have to fight for a national solution. The fight for gerrymandering over the course of the last 10 years has been state by state. And that didn't work. And it didn't work because good people in some places could be outdone by people acting in their own self-interest elsewhere. And so if we're going to fix this, it's going to require a national solution that's fair to everybody. And I think that's what people of good faith and good intent ought to be working towards, understanding that we are on a broken path. We are heading further down the broken path. It's a race to the bottom, and we're not that far away. And once we get to the bottom,
constitutional amendment, Is that what you're saying? Like we rise up?
I think Congress could do this with an act of Congress. I think Congress could do this statutorily. Once you hit the bottom and you can't go any further, you've got to start thinking about how you dig out. And so I fear we are about to hit the bottom. And then we can maybe have a conversation about how we start coming out of the hole we've dug. I think that the best way forward is a more proportional House that, is passed by Congress and that forces every state to draw larger multi-member districts that can't be gerrymandered. And each of those districts will, if they're districts of 3, 4, and 5, you will elect Democrats, Republicans, maybe even independents out of all of them everywhere. I mean, I'm talking to you from Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a 9-0 Democratic state. I mean, that's crazy. There's plenty of Republicans here. It's a 60-40 state, but it's 100-0 in representation. And that's not right, and it's bad for our politics. It would be good for our politics if we had some Massachusetts Republicans in office. And, Tennessee is about to go 9-0 the other way. And that's not right. And it would be good for our politics if we had some Tennessee Democrats in there. So let's do this. Let's find a way to make all of these states, and the only solution is a national one. And it's going to have to bring fairness everywhere. And if we can find a way to do this, I think we will look back on these 250 years of gerrymandering and say, what the heck were we thinking?
I love your optimism, but as an American, I know that
we're this optimism, boy. I was telling you at the beginning that I don't get invited to a lot of parties, and
like Americans are not good at reflecting back, and learning from our mistakes. So chances are to be like, another 250 years, and then there'll be another people redistricting again. But I am curious though about. What do some of those institutional reforms actually look like? I mean, is it ranked choice voting? Is it going to popular vote? What are those things? Because it seems like we're at a moment now where people are probably a little bit more open to ideas. They're like, hey, what we have going has been great, but it's not really working anymore. I don't know about third party, but I also hear about ranked choice voting. I don't know enough about it. So what are the solutions?
Yeah, I think that if we want to fix the gerrymandering problem and the racial representation problem in the U.S. House, the best fix is a more proportional system that uses larger multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. And if if a state like Virginia has 11 districts, so if you had one district of 5 and 2 districts of 3, or 3-3-4. 3-3-4 wouldn't get you there. My math is already off. You're making me do math. Anyway, if you had 3 multi-member districts that were essentially the same size in all of these states, it's a lot easier to think about in Massachusetts. 3-3-3. And if you used ranked choice voting, you would see that the Democrats, the Republicans, and the independents in all of these places actually had representation, because you would have enough voters to elect somebody with a third, right? I mean, if you're electing 3 people in a district, somebody wins if they have 26% of the vote. You can't keep somebody out. You can't keep a political party or a racial group out if the 26% is enough to win representation. So a more proportional form is really the way to go. Don Beyer from Virginia has got a really good plan. It's called the Fair Representation Act, and it would do exactly this, right? You would see a 6-3 delegation in Massachusetts, probably a 6-3 delegation in Tennessee. Alabama, Louisiana would keep Black representation in proportion to their numbers. I think you would continue to see a Congress that actually reflected the ideological and population breakdown of a state. But, that makes too much sense, right?
It makes way too much sense. You just stop talking, Dave. It's too smart. It's too logical.
I don't get that all the time.
It's making me uncomfortable with how rational it is. So here's kind of the last, big question, and it's kind of a whopper, I think.
All right.
Do you think? Well, and I think I know the answer to this question, but it's more like it's kind of a yes or no question, but it really gets into like yes or no and why. Do you think that? Can a democracy be healthy if it's increasingly about manipulating the rules before a vote is even cast? Right? Like, and I guess how quickly is that unhealth going to manifest itself? It already is, I'm sure, but I don't know. Does the question make sense? How can
it makes great sense? I think that a democracy is not a democracy if people can't change their elected officials. So
Yes.
Elections have to be about what, a democracy comes down to consent of the governed.
Yes.
And what gerrymandering and what all of these manipulations do is they interfere with consent of the governed. And if we don't have a way to vote the rascals out, or if a majority of us cannot come together at the ballot box and replace or create a government that is by and for the people, then elections have no purpose. And you're not in a democracy. And once you can't use elections to express your opinions about the direction of a nation, you open the doors to other ways of that frustration coming out and being expressed. So when you don't have healthy elections, you don't have a healthy nation, let alone a healthy democracy. And so, yes, I fear that, very quickly we're heading down a road in which if we don't think about these big structural fixes to big structural problems, we are going to find ourselves in a place that we didn't imagine could happen here in our lifetimes.
Wow. I appreciate the candidness. I do appreciate the candor because it's important. I think that we understand what's at stake here. How can people get involved? The normal person listening to them, what do you recommend they do? How can they connect with you and your work and what you guys
absolutely.
are doing?
I'm a fellow at FairVote. You can find FairVote at fairvote.org, where you can find all kinds of information about the Fair Representation Act and proportional representation. I've got a bunch of books. You can find my books. There's a new one called Antidemocratic that you can find everywhere, and I won't have to say the names of the other ones. You can find me on Blue Sky. I'm Dave Daley on Blue Sky. I'm Dave Daley 3 over on Twitter. FairVote is up on all the socials as well. There's a lot that people can do to fight for, ranked choice voting, for proportional representation in their towns and their communities. I think we have to have these conversations with our friends and our neighbors. It's why I'm so grateful for you all and for Faithful Politics, for the chance to come on and have, meaningful dialogue about change, because that's how we make change, by talking to one another and trying to convince and persuade. So let's keep doing it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David, for coming on the show, spending some time with us, man. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Always a pleasure here as well. So absolutely anytime. Thanks again.
Absolutely. And to our viewers and our listeners, guys, thanks for joining us. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with your crazy Uncle Frank, with your sweet Aunt Sally. Whoever needs to hear it, we need to get this stuff out there. and have these conversations. Look in the description. We'll put links. And until next time, guys, keep your conversations not right or left, but thanks and God bless.